Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to AP Euro, your first lesson here of the course. Basically, what we're going to be doing with this summer assignment is there's going to be two videos here, this one that you're looking at, and then one other one that we're going to cover some of the background information leading up into the course. So what you should have for this assignment is this worksheet here, the crises of the later Middle Ages. We'll be going through this sheet. Please, if you can, the best idea would be to be able to print this out and have it next to you and fill it out as we go through the video. If you're not able to do that, please just contact me and we can figure something out. Or if you can't get this, at least follow along with it and have a piece of loose leaf paper out next to you to write down any pertinent notes and information. Okay, so we're going to be looking at here, as you can see, some crises of the later Middle Ages to set the stage for the beginning of our course. In particular, we're going to look at to what extent did the crises of the 14th century shape life in the later Middle Ages. So let's first start by talking about what the term Middle Ages means. Hopefully in your 9th grade global history course you covered a little bit of the Middle Ages, so this term is not something completely new to you. When we talk about the Middle Ages, we're referring to the period of modern history between ancient and modern times, hence the Middle Ages. It is in the middle of two other distinct time periods. Historians say that the ancient world comprises Rome, and at the end of that would be the fall of Rome, and the modern world starts with the beginning of the period of the Renaissance. So in particular, when we're talking about the Middle Ages, what is it in the middle of? It is in the middle of the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. So that's what we're talking about here with the Middle Ages. So something you should think about here is that one of the big themes we're going to see in this course is the concept of periodization, of making time periods. So you have here three distinct time periods that historians have said are three separate periods of European history: Rome, the Classical Age, the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance. So what we're going to be discussing with the idea of periodization is what makes each of these a distinct time period. Are there different characteristics? Are there anything that's the same? Can you make an argument that these should not be distinct time periods? So that's all something you should think about. So the reason why we're doing this background here on the later Middle Ages is to set the stage for the Renaissance. The course will start with the period of the Renaissance, so we want to know what's going on in Europe right as that period is starting. So that's what this lesson is going to be about. The Middle Ages itself is a pretty long time period, about 1,000 years or so from the fall of Rome until the Renaissance. The Middle Ages itself can be divided up into different periods. What we'll be discussing here is the end of it, the late or the high Middle Ages, around 1100 to 1300, and then 1300 to about 1500. You'll see on the first day of school we'll talk about the time periods in this course. The first time period starts at 1450. So this lesson here is going to be around, a little bit before that time period, again, just setting the stage for what's going to be coming with the period of the Renaissance. So what we're going to start with here, which is also on the worksheet that you should have next to you, are these quotes here. These quotes come from the book of Revelation. If you're not familiar with the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation is the last book of the New Testament. The New Testament is the second book of the Bible. And as you should recall, during the Middle Ages, people in Western Europe were highly, highly religious. The Roman Catholic Church was the most powerful, most influential force in the continent. And so this book of Revelation becomes a very important aspect of the Bible during the High Middle Ages. So take a second right now and just look over these quotes here. Read over the quotes and try to figure out what kind of themes are there here in this book of Revelation. Okay, so if you need some more time, you can pause the video here and just continue to read it, but hopefully you get the point. The major themes here, what should be jumping out at you is the idea of war, death, destruction. The book of Revelation actually talks about the apocalypse. This picture on the left here is a engraving of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So the book of Revelation talks a lot about death, destruction of the world, the end of the world, things like that. Really positive, fun things. So during the later Middle Ages, this book of Revelation inspired countless sermons, speeches, pieces of artwork. This is something that dominated the lives, the minds, the imaginations of the people living in Europe. And one common concept that I'm going to stress a lot during this year is that the entertainment, the artwork, the cultural aspects of a society reflect that society's values and reflects what's going on in that society during that time. So the idea here is to make the connection. Why was the book of Revelation and the idea of death and destruction and the apocalypse, why was that so much on the minds of people in Europe during the Middle Ages? Well, the simple answer here is that because people living during this time were living through a period of crisis. There were a number of different crises that were going on that were making life very difficult for the people of Europe. So this idea of death and destruction and the four horsemen of the apocalypse, it seemed to a lot of the people living during that time that they might be living through the apocalypse because that's how stressful life was for them. So in particular, the specific crises going on, which if you could fill these in the box on your worksheet, would be climate change coinciding with a massive famine. The Black Plague, which hopefully you had covered a little bit last year in your 9th grade courses, we'll review briefly here in this video. The 100 Years' War, and then division within the Roman Catholic Church, which, as I stated before, was the most powerful, dominating, governing force. So we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to do the first 3 bullets here in this video and then talk more about the church in the next video. So some background info to understand these crises going on. So from the year about 1000 CE to about 1300 CE, the climate was a bit warmer than usual. During this period, a system called the 3-field system of farming was adopted. It's pretty simple. It involves 3 major fields. So you can see in the picture. Field 1 for a year would grow wheat. Field 2 would grow barley, and the 3rd field would lay fallow. And this field would not be growing anything, but it would be allowed for animals to go and graze on it. And the purpose of this was to allow that 3rd field to rebuild itself and regrow. Now the following year they would rotate. Field 2 would now grow wheat. Field 3 would grow barley, and Field 1 would lay fallow to allow the soil to regenerate, because farming is very, especially growing wheat and barley, is very tough on the soil. And year after year of it, eventually the soil would just give out. You'd need a year for it to allow it to replenish itself for the following year. So at the time, this did allow for more productive farming because you weren't constantly destroying your land and you were allowing it to rebuild itself. We'll talk later on about how this was not the most effective form of farming, but at the time period from 1000 to 1300, this was effective. It did allow for more productive farming, which in turn led to more food and a higher population. So going into the high Middle Ages, or the later end of the Middle Ages, the population of Europe was growing. Now, you can see on this chart here, this shows you the average yearly temperature in Europe from about 1000 till about the modern age, till about 1900, 2000. You can see in the beginning of this chart, the period we just talked about, 1000 till about 1300, where the temperatures were higher than normal. This allowed more productive food production, which led to a higher population. But then around 1300, 1350 or so, you can see that something starts to happen, and the temperatures dropped drastically. And now keep in mind, now you have a higher population to feed, but yet the temperature is falling. And this period of falling temperatures will continue until the modern world, until about the year 1900 or so. This period of a drastic drop in temperatures is something that has been called the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was a period between about 1300 and 1870, during which Europe and North America were subjected to much colder winters than during the 20th century. The period can be divided into 2 phases, the first beginning around 1300 and continuing into the late 1400s. That is the period that we're discussing here in this video. There was a slightly warmer period in the 1500s, after which the climate deteriorated substantially. The period between 1600 and 1800 marks the height of the Little Ice Age. So this will be something we'll be coming back to later on and during the year when we get to the year 1600 and 1800. So the Little Ice Age is definitely something you want to remember. As you can see from this chart, if we go back for a second to the graph, it is a very long period of time of these drop in temperatures. You can see here the peak of it about 1600 to 1800. So this will be something we'll talk about again. Now, from about 1300 to 1400, this drop in climate had some drastic impacts on the people of Europe. So if you think about logically, what impact will a colder climate have? Are you thinking about some stuff? Okay, hopefully you're thinking here that there's going to be less harvests, right? A colder climate means a shorter growing season, which means less food. Now remember, that population of Europe had just began to grow. So now you have more people that you have to feed, but less food to feed them. So what does this lead to? Periods of famine. And in fact, from 1315 to 1322, there was a 7-year period known as the Great Famine, where almost every child born in Western Europe faced the probability of extreme hunger at least once or twice during his expected 30 to 35 years of life. That's right, the life expectancy for the average person living in the Middle Ages was only to about 30 or 35. So that means you guys right now would probably be about middle age if you lived during the Middle Ages. That shows you how difficult life was. Again, connecting to that idea of this book of Revelation. Life was not easy. Famine made it even harder. Now, famine, naturally you're going to think about the idea of the effect of famine, right? People are hungry, people are starving, people are going to die. But people did not only die from not having enough food, but these poor diets also made people more susceptible to diseases. So take a look at the year, the 14th century here. What big disease hit Europe during the 14th century? You should be thinking right now about the Black Death. So this famine and the drop in temperatures, which led to shorter growing seasons and poorer harvests, which led to famine, also made people more susceptible to disease. So when the Black Death hit, not only did it hit because of some of the other things we'll discuss, but also because people did not have strong enough diets to keep themselves healthy. So let's talk a little bit now about the Black Death. Again, the idea of the apocalypse. The Black Death definitely made the people living through it feel like they were living during the end of the world. It seemed to them that that the human race was going to be wiped out, and that this was what the book of Revelation was discussing. So think back to what you learned about in 9th grade about the causes of the Black Death. If you recall, there was the idea about the rats. Rats were very common in towns and cities, and there were fleas that would drink the blood of a rat that would carry the bacteria. They would then jump onto humans and infect the humans. But more importantly than these rats was the resurgence of trade that was happening during the Middle Ages. So if you remember, after the period of the Crusades, where Western Europeans traveled all the way over to the Middle East, they came in contact with all these goods and spices and amazing things that they had never seen before. They brought them back to Western Europe, and the demand for those products grew, which led to the increase in trade. So you have this immense intensifying resurgence of trade going on. And if you look at these two maps side by side, the spread of the Black Death matches pretty closely with these new medieval trade routes. So the negative side of trade is that as people spread, not only do goods and ideas spread, but diseases come with them. So the plague was spread along these trade routes all over Western Europe. And in fact, the plague started over in China in 1333, but you can see between along the trade routes, the Silk Road route, and then some of their sea routes, it reached Europe by the mid-1300s and had a devastating impact on Europe as well. So causes of the Black Death, which we can write down, as we said, the fleas on the rats. More importantly, that intensifying trade, that the disease spread along these trade routes. And then, of course, the famine that we discussed and the poor diets that help to spread the disease and make people more susceptible to it. So the Black Death hit Europe pretty hard for a number of years. The plague would disappear in the winter months and then come back hard in the spring and the summer months And you started to see pictures like this all around, this dance of death. A lot of the artwork has death and the apocalypse and skeletons and people dancing on graves and on corpses, because death was literally all around these people. They didn't understand where the plague was coming from. They didn't know how to stop it. They felt it was a punishment from God for living ungodly, horrible lives, and it made people crazy. And there wasn't, in their minds, there was no way to stop it. Eventually, the plague does die out for reasons that historians have argued about over the years. But when the plague at least stopped coming in this intense fashion, it did leave some lasting effects. So some of the effects of the Black Death: 1/3 of Europe's population died, which obviously led to a population decrease. A decrease in production happened now because you have less people working, less people making things, which meant that there are less goods, which means the prices for these goods went higher. That's the basic laws of supply and demand. You have a low supply of something, the price is going to go higher. However, less people also meant that there were less workers. Less workers meant the people that survived, that were left behind, there was a low supply of them, so they could demand higher wages. And that's what does start to happen, is that the people that survive can now be paid more money for their work. The effect of this was that the feudal system of the Middle Ages begins to break apart. Serfs and peasants were able to charge money for their work now because there were less of them around. Once they had enough money, they were able to buy their freedom and then migrate to the towns and cities that had been growing right before the Black Death hit. So you're going to start to see the breakdown of this manor system, this feudal system. You're going to also see a decrease in trade. Now, something important to note here is that these will not be lasting effects. Within 100 to 200 years, Europe will bounce back. Their population will start to come back. Their trade will restore itself pretty quickly. When we get into our course starting about 1450 and talking about the period of the Renaissance, trade, especially in the Mediterranean region, was back to even higher levels than before the plague. So although these are very significant, very dramatic effects, they will not be permanent effects on Europe, but they will be effects that Europe will have to deal with and have to overcome moving forward. So in addition to the famine and disease, you're going to also see warfare that was ripping apart Europe during the end of the Middle Ages. In particular, the largest war was something called the 100 Years' War, fought between England and France from 1337 to 1452. So about 100 years, hence the clever name, the 100 Years' War. It was not a consistently fought war. You'd have brief periods of peace that would happen, and then war would break out again. So this was really a series of little wars, but because they were between the same main nations and because they were fought over the same basic, for the same basic reasons, we look at it today as just one giant conflict. So follow along on your notes as we just discuss a little bit about this 100 Years' War. So in order to understand the 100 Years' War, let's do a little bit of review and go backwards. What type of system dominated Europe during the Middle Ages? We just said it before on a couple of slides ago, so hopefully you are thinking of the feudal system. So if you remember, the feudal system was the system that was set up. It was a mutually beneficial system for the people living in Europe during the Middle Ages. And it was basically the series of mutual obligations between different groups of people. So the king needed loyalty, and he needed a military every time he was being attacked, so he would turn to the lords. He would give the lords land and would protect them in return for their loyalty and for their military support. So what that meant was that anytime the king was faced with being attacked, whether it was by a barbarian, so-called barbarian tribe, whether it was being attacked by another king or another powerful lord, he would turn to his vassals, his lords that had pledged their loyalty to him, and he would ask for their knights and for an army to fight for the king. In return, the lords had gotten land and all those peasants and serfs that came on the land. So, and if you recall, one other thing is just that the system was set up because of the instability and violence of the period, is that kings needed this loyalty, needed this military. Lords and the lesser people needed protection and land, hence this system developed. Now, who exerted the most power under this system? If you look at the chart, you would naturally think, well, the king's at the top, the king must exert the most power. In reality, however, it was the powerful lords that had the most power. Why was it the lords that had the most power? Well, number one, they had the military. They had the knights. They had the serfs. They had the people that would do the fighting. When a king needed the military, they called the lords to supply them with knights. So the kings relied on the lords to fund their army. The lords also are the ones that controlled locally the day-to-day operations going on in their territories. Remember, the king gave them land and gave them the people living on the land. So the lords are the ones who collected taxes from the people. The lords are the one who dealt with justice and things going on in each region. And although the lords, yes, had given their loyalty to the king, remember that they just signed an oath or said an oath. If a different king or a different lord or a different person offered them a better deal, it was not uncommon for lords to switch their loyalties pretty quickly, and a king would be left without any support. So that's something to remember here going into our course as well, because this is a concept and idea that we'll come back to a little bit later on. Something also to note is that because of this system, there are really no nation states that exist in Europe just yet. No modern nations like we know them today. There's not even a common real culture amongst people just yet. That is something that we're going to see develop throughout our course. Okay, so we have here this situation going on. So because of this, in 1337, the French king actually only controlled about half of his country. The orange pieces there in the map are the territory that the king actually controlled. The light purple areas are areas that other vassals had control of. Particularly look at Brittany and Burgundy and Flanders. Those are areas that were immensely populated, that were very important strategically, and that were operated by powerful lords who were not under the control of the French king. That's going to play a role in this 100 Years' War. The green area down in the south there is controlled by England. So that provides some of this background to the start of the 100 Years' War. That territory right there is the Duchy of Aquitaine. So let's talk about what the word duchy means. This is a word that we're going to see come up again. A duchy is a territory ruled over by a duke. Pretty simple enough. So the Duchy of Aquitaine was ruled over by the Duke of Aquitaine. But what's significant for the 100 Years' War is that the Duke of Aquitaine was actually the King of England. So how does that happen? Well, the Duchy of Aquitaine had been under the rule of a woman named Eleanor of Aquitaine. In 1152, Eleanor married the English King Henry II. So coming with her marriage, she came in with all this land. So now being married, the English king gained control of that land. When Eleanor passed away, her son, who became the next King of England, then controlled Aquitaine. Side note, Eleanor of Aquitaine is actually a very fascinating woman in history. I wish we had more time to talk about her. If you're interested in any sort of medieval history or women in history at a time when women did not play a very significant role in anything, Eleanor of Aquitaine becomes an immensely powerful figure in England. So if you are interested, look her up online. She's very, very interesting. I wish we had more time to talk about her. Anyway, so now Aquitaine falls under the control of the English. So in 1259, King Henry III agreed to pay homage to the French king in order to maintain control of Aquitaine. But by 1300, the French king is now looking to expand his power. He faces a lot of opposition from those powerful vassals in Brittany and Burgundy who don't want to fall under his control. So the immediate causes of this is you have all those background things, but the war breaks out when you have dispute over the succession to the French throne. The French king, Charles IV, had died without an heir. His closest relative is his sister Isabella's son, who happens to be the King of England. If you're confused, basically Charles IV, the King of France, his sister Isabella of France had married the English King Edward II. Isabella had Edward III. So basically Edward III, because Charles dies without any sons, Edward III is his nephew. That's the closest male relative. If this seems confusing, don't worry guys, it gets even more confusing as we go on throughout the years. It's very complicated, the royal marriages and monarchies of everybody in England, because basically they all just married each other. They wanted to keep alliances, keep bloodlines together, and it does become very confusing. Everybody's brother and sister, cousins, first cousins, second cousins, they all have the same names. It does become complicated, but don't worry, we'll figure out the basics. Okay, so you have here Edward III. He is the nephew of Charles IV. When Charles IV dies, Edward has a pretty strong claim to the French throne. The French people, however, especially the nobility there, do not want an English king because they don't want to expand his power anymore. So the nobility decide they're going to choose Philip of Valois instead to become the king. They crown him, they coronate him, he becomes King Philip VI. Well, Edward says, no, 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 I'm the closest relative, that was my uncle, I should have the throne. He goes and gets the support of the dukes of Burgundy, Brittany, and Flanders, remember, who are against the French king. Hence, the tensions build, and then war breaks out when Philip VI decides, forget you, Edward, you're the King of England, stay over there, I'm going to take Aquitaine and rule over this area, and that's when the conflict starts. So that's just some background there. We're not going to get caught up in the crazy details about the 100 Years' War. Really, the causes and effects are, and more importantly, the effects of it are what you need to know going into this period of the Renaissance. Again, there's plenty of stuff online, videos, stuff like that. If you're interested, I encourage you go look it up. But for our purposes, you just really have to know what this war was, and more importantly, the effects of it. So one of the things that come out of this war is new technology. Particularly the longbow and cannons. This is the first major war in Western Europe where cannons are used. The longbow is what it exactly says it is. It is a long bow, but it could shoot farther distances, and it was easier to reload quicker. So it allowed kings to have their armies attack from farther away. And cannons, you can imagine, think rationally about what a cannon is, the effect it would have. Having gunpowder, being able to put more force into your battles. In particular, what cannons do is that it makes stone fortifications kind of useless. And that's going to be really important because during the Middle Ages, kings would build big castles surrounded by big stone walls. Medieval warfare involved a lot of sieges of these walls. When a king was being attacked, he would have all his people and his army come behind the walls. They'd lift up the gates. Sometimes these walls would be surrounded by moats, and the attacking army would have to get over said walls, and it was very, very difficult for them to get over these big stone walls. They couldn't break them down, and it was too hard for them to climb over it. Once cannons now come into play, you just shoot cannons at the wall, and you're able to break down the wall. So cannons are going to completely change warfare, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit more later on as well, but just the 100 Years' War is the first time that cannons are significant. So during this fighting, the English originally gained some success. They're even able to take Paris in 1422. For a brief time, King Henry VI of England is also recognized as the King of France. But at that point, enter another very famous woman in history, Joan la Pucelle, or as she is better known, Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was a French peasant girl who, at a young age, began having visions that the saints spoke to her and told her that she must help bring the French king back to power. So she actually physically led some French attacks, she drove the British out of Orleans, and she had some other major victories. However, unfortunately for her, shortly after her victory, she is captured and she's burned at the stake for heresy, thinking that how dare you say that you were talking to God or that God spoke to you, you're just a peasant woman, so they burnt her at the stake. But the importance of Joan of Arc is that she inspires the French and she rallies them to push the British out of French land. So those victories that the British had because of Joan of Arc and because of her rallying of the French troops, they push the British out of France. And the French continue their victories after her death. In 1435, the Duke of Burgundy abandoned the English and decides to throw his support behind Charles VII. At that point, Burgundy kind of begins to fall under the control of the French king. By 1453, only Calais remained in English control. So the results of this 100 Years' War is that Aquitaine and any other areas that the English had gained will now be removed from them. The French king will gain them. So that's just a again, very brief summary of the Hundred Years' War and things that happened. So for our purposes, what'll be important are the effects of this, because our course is going to start kind of right at the end of this Hundred Years' War. So when we get into the first time period, Europe and especially England and France are going to be recovering from this 100 years of fighting. First effect, most of the fighting of the Hundred Years' War took place in France. So France is physically and economically devastated. Their land is destroyed. Their population has decreased. They had a series of bad harvests because their land had been destroyed and villages had been burnt to the ground. So France is going to take the brunt of the destruction and is going to need to take some more time to recover. You're going to see economic problems for both England and France. War is an expensive thing, something we'll talk about a lot during this year, so a lot of the times financing a war leads to some economic problems amongst the different countries. In England in particular, the Hundred Years' War stimulated the development of Parliament. Parliament is their lawmaking legislative body. It does still exist today. It's basically kind of like their version of Congress. The roots of Parliament go back all the way to the Hundred Years' War. It originally started as a meeting of the most powerful nobles in England. The word Parliament actually comes from the French word parler, which means to meet. During the Hundred Years' War, as I had said before, war is expensive. The King of England needed money to fight this war. He couldn't raise taxes himself because remember the local lords are more powerful in each area, so he called this parliament every time he needed money. So the tradition here, or the precedent, establishing the precedent of calling Parliament to raise money for the king, was established during the Hundred Years' War. This is something that we will see remain a very, very strong tradition in England throughout English history. There will even be a whole civil war fought in England over this concept, so that's something important to remember. In France, it's going to help the power of the monarchy grow. If you looked at that map earlier, you can rewind the video to go back and look at it if you need to, that by the end of the Hundred Years' War, a lot of those territories that were not under the control of the French king will now fall under the control of the French king. So emerging out of the Hundred Years' War, you're going to see a powerful monarchy grow in France. So just like in England where you're going to have this tradition of a powerful parliament, in France you're going to see a little bit different here of the tradition of a powerful monarchy, which is something we're going to discuss later on as well. Finally, in both England and France, this war is going to promote the growth of nationalism. Nothing like a good old war to bring people together. It promotes unity amongst yourselves, fighting a common enemy, rallying a spirit of a nation and of a common goal, a common culture, a common identity. And that's what the 100 Years' War will do. As I said before, we're not seeing nation states or nations and countries the way we do today. We're not seeing them just yet, but you can see the roots of that starting to start to piece together after this 100 Years' War. So these are the effects you should have written down on your worksheet. At this point, we should have all 3 of those pages filled out, and you should have some sense of what's going on here during this period of the later Middle Ages. Here is just a little chart that I found online somewhere. There's a typo here in the High Middle Ages. It shouldn't say 3000. It should say about like 1300 or so. But you see here some of the things going on in the High Middle Ages. You see kind of some of the ups and downs leading up to the upwards last part of the Renaissance, which again will be our first unit and where this course will start. So now at this point, hopefully you're able to answer this question. The assignment for this, the big thing will be to write a written response to this. Why was the Book of Revelation such a common theme for sermons and speeches during the late Middle Ages? Please make sure you use specific examples from the notes that we discussed as well as this video when you're answering this question. So we're going to kind of end here and just set the stage for the next video. Is now at this point you should understand that living during the Middle Ages there was a period of difficult things, crises going on, and the most powerful force, the most powerful institution will be the one that will have to try to deal with these crises and try to keep the people together. And as we discussed before, that most powerful force, the most powerful institution during this period was not kings just yet. It was the Roman Catholic Church. So the second half of your assignment will be the second video where we will be discussing the Roman Catholic Church and how effectively or not effectively they dealt with these problems. So that's what we'll be doing next. Thank you guys so much for listening and following along. Make sure you write down any questions so we can discuss, and I will see you guys soon. Thanks. Bye.